Hello and welcome to the Arsenal Women Arsecast with me, your presenter, Tim Stillman. And today we've got a bit of a meta episode for you, which is my favourite type of content to make in the world is meta content, not Mark Zuckerberg shite, but like content about content. And this an episode I've kind of wanted to do for quite a few months, actually, but we were on a very deliberate kind of timescale with our 100th episode a couple of weeks ago with Leah Williamson, so I couldn't really add extra episodes in. But anyway, I think probably best place to have this discussion. Delighted to be joined by presenter of Counterpressed, which I'm sure many of our listeners listen to, as well as editor of the Cutback, Flo Lloyd Hughes.
Thanks,
Flo,
Tim. Thanks so much for having me, and apologies to listeners. I'm recovering from a bit of a Christmas cold, so I'm probably not sounding my clearest and best. But yeah, so great to chat to you, and I'm really excited because I love doing stuff like this as well. And I think people are really interested in it. Sometimes it can feel like a little bit navel-gazy, but actually, when we've done episodes a bit like this on Counterpressed, we get so much feedback of people who find it really interesting. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. We did like a meta episode in the summer with Tom Gary about transfer reporting and stuff like that, and people really loved that. So I'm confident it might be a bit navel-gazy, I'm not going to lie. But I think people will really like this. And Flo, just to kind of set things up a little bit, obviously like football is, and women's football as well, very competitive industry to try to get into. There's more people that want to do it than there are kind of spots available, really. So I'm just interested in your kind of general journey into football content, men's, women's, like how did you get here?
Actually, it's one that I don't really probably tap into that much. So I started in the men's game, which I think for both you and I and our generations is the traditional route into football in general and football media. Whereas I think for the people coming up younger than us, it is different now because women's football is more of an entry point overall. But yeah, everything for me has come through the men's game. But as I played football growing up and always followed like the Women's FA Cup, because that was all that was on TV, and England women, those were my touch points for the women's games. But yeah, I started out really in journalism in my third year of university. So I did a study abroad in the US at the University of Miami in Florida. And as lots of people who are English who've ever been to the US will know, that when you go there with English accent, people think you're really intelligent and really interesting. So when I was there, I got into campus radio, and obviously in the US, university sport is not like it is here. It's a whole industry. It's highly professionalized, even though it's still sort of amateur, which is a whole conversation in itself. So I was doing student radio there. I was doing commentary on women's basketball, on baseball, and doing like sports talk radio stuff. So that was in 2015. And that's when I was like, okay, I really want to get into journalism now. Came back to uni, finished my last year at Edinburgh, and I was doing like student newspaper stuff. And then I just applied for an internship at a sports business trade newspaper, or like online place, which is quite niche, but it was a good foundation. So I worked there for 2.5 years, and I was writing about like media rights, sponsorship, bidding for the World Cup, bidding for the Olympic Games. It was kind of broad sports business. And then I actually kind of shifted a little bit and went and worked for a sports charity in PR and comms for a couple of years. But I really wanted to still work in journalism and media. So I began to slowly kind of build up my freelancing. I started working on just a volunteer QPR fan podcast, which, as you all know, Tim, like those things can be kind of exhausting, but it was like a big entry point into podcasting. So that would have been around 2016 as well, where podcasting, I think, was probably reaching like some of its biggest explosions. And then in 2019, that's when I really kind of made a shift. Jonathan Fisher, who used to produce Guardian Football Weekly, I think you'll know him, Tim, and he's also one of our producers on Counterpressed, because he now works for Spotify, actually, which was a weird kind of full circle. He reached out to me on Twitter when Twitter used to be actually a great opportunity for work. Sadly, because of Elon Musk, it's no longer a great opportunity to build that portfolio. And it's really tough because I get a lot of questions from people asking about how they kind of build something without Twitter there, and maybe we can come on to that. But Jonathan reached out to me and said, would you want to come on Guardian Football Weekly? And that having the opportunity to go on such a big global men's football podcast basically was like a huge sliding doors moment that I do think like changed the trajectory of my career massively. Started freelancing on BBC Radio London doing match reporting, so this is all around 2019. And then as the freelancing got much busier, just before the pandemic, before I knew a pandemic was coming, I made the very, what I thought was wise decision to quit my full-time job and go fully into football. And then about a week later, all football was postponed indefinitely, and I sort of panicked, and I had to kind of ride it out for a bit. I got a couple of jobs that were good enough to pay my rent, and then like remote production jobs on podcasts, because I was also doing that. And then, as you all know, once football came back after the pandemic, it just has not stopped because of the calendar. It's bigger. It's now back to back to back. And it was really after the Women's Euros in 2022, unsurprisingly, where my work balance shifted from probably about 60-70% men's game stuff to the other way around, where probably now about 70% of the stuff I do is women's football. Whereas, only just a few years ago, I wasn't having enough paid stuff in women's football. It was much more men's game radio stuff, only men's game TV stuff. Whereas now I think with the amount of coverage, that has massively shifted. So hopefully that wasn't, I know that was probably longer than you expected, but that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour anyway.
Yeah, I guess that was one of the things I was going to ask. And yeah, like so many interesting kind of touch points there about how do people build portfolio without Twitter. Get a website, guys. Always have something that anchors your content, because like on Arseblog, we basically don't use Twitter anymore for basically anything, but the website is there. Newsletters, stuff like that. Take your audience with you, give them an anchor. But I mean, that was one of the other things I was going to ask as well, because you're a QPR fan in men's terms, and obviously in the women's game, QPR, I mean, let's say it frankly, don't really do anything and haven't ever really done anything. So what was it that really kind of, I guess, energized you about women's football and women's football content, given like your own club isn't hugely active in that space?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I think I was always really interested in the women's national team and had like experiences like being able to interact with players from an early age. So like I played football for QPR. So through that, like had touch points with football at a decent level. Like we used to play Tottenham a lot before Tottenham decided to take women's football seriously. So I think my exposure to women's football had always been there, and Loftus Road occasionally would host games. When Rachel Yankee was at Fulham and when Fulham were leading the way in the women's game, my school used to have a lot of sessions from them because I grew up in West London. So there was always little bits there. And it was kind of something that throughout my career, like when I was at school, I was really interested in like gender and sport and feminism, and women's football is quite a big touch point for that as well, and how kind of women express themselves in sport. And that carried on into my university, where I studied sports management, and there's a lot of like sport and social history crossover. So I was always really kind of passionate about growing women's football as like someone who's really passionate about women's sport and passionate about the women's game. And I think that is how a lot of people have viewed women's football in the previous decade, is about like growing the game because we believe in it as followers, as supporters of women's football and women's sport and women in general. Now, for me personally, I think we are seeing and should see a shift where the growth of it because we believe in it is now shifting to the growth of it because it's a phenomenal sport and product and entertainment. And that for me is this next decade now. It's no longer just we're we're giving this the energy because we believe in it, because we relate to it, because we want to see it grow. It's now like standing on its own and no longer needs that kind of narrative, in my opinion.
All of these are like things I'm really kind of fascinated about, and you're talking about there about like the interrelation between gender and sport and how women express themselves in this space. One of the reasons I'm so fascinated about that is because that's not my route in at all. I came in through a club, and you know, I've said this many times before, like when I went to watch Arsenal ladies for the first time in like the mid-90s, I didn't really imagine that I'd end up arguing on the internet with dickheads about gender politics. That wasn't really like, that wasn't really my entry point into it. It was just through a club. But I think one of the reasons I really wanted to get you on in particular to have this discussion, it seems to me, Flo, from the outside, you've had some quite established gigs in terms of women's football. And it seems to me as well that I say walked away, but like you've kind of done your own thing. So Counterpressed, which we'll come on to in a minute, which I think really addresses something that was really missing in the women's football content space, and now doing the Cutback as well. And is this a conscious thing on your part to really kind of, it's almost like in the music industry, right? Getting your own record label rather than going on other labels. Like, did you always want to have that level of independence, or is it just kind of happened
It's
as
kind
you've
of
gone along?
happened organically, actually. So, it's funny because I think you're right. There's jobs that I've had where I felt like, okay, is this me taking in the right direction, or do I feel like I'm putting my energy into the sort of content that I really do want to make? And the way that Counterpress came about was kind of just off the back of the Euros, and the timeline was pretty tight because I was doing up front with Chloe and Rachel, which I love doing, and you know, if the opportunity with Spotify hadn't come along, would have carried on doing. So it wasn't about trying to do something different, because I think the trajectory we were on, we were creating something really good and different anyway, and they're still doing that, and I think that those guys do a great job. I think for me, it was like, okay, can we like take that one step further, and really try and create something that feels unique and different, and fills a different gap around the way that women's football is spoken about, and moves it away from this kind of real traditional, like, I guess, men's lens on things, but also like lets people have fun with it, but also brings analysis, which I think has always been missing in women's football coverage. So that was kind of how Counterpress came about. And we had to, because obviously I was doing up front with the guys in the summer, I wanted to make sure that we started fresh, and I didn't start the season with them and then leave halfway. So there was a bit of this kind of like rush to put it together, and then we were sort of like building it as we went. And now I think, you know, 3 years in, I feel like we really found our feet of how we want it to look, how we want it to sound, and kind of continue to evolve that. With the Cutback, I'd freelanced with so many different places over the years, whether it was writing, radio, whatever, and had just been really surprised that no one had made the move to fully focus on in-depth women's football analysis. I really was just surprised that it hadn't come along, and it was something that I wanted to start during the pandemic, but I just wasn't sure how it would look. In my head, I thought, oh, I need to get like 50 grand to build this website from scratch, to build a paywall, to do all this, that. So I kind of sat on it. And then, as you'll know, Tim, places like Substack that are really having such a continued growth spurt since the pandemic, and are really easy to use, really intuitive for users, and have great communities on them. That felt like the perfect place to build the proof of concept for the Cutback, to deliver it to an audience where it's easy to read, where it can be delivered in newsletter form, but we're actually building a website. Then we'll build, you know, content that will sit behind a paywall and go from there. And it kind of just came to me in the summer just gone, where I thought, fuck it, if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do it. And I spent so many years just sitting around complaining about about what the content I want to see not being there. And actually sometimes you've just got to be like, well, if you don't do it, then it really feels like no one else will. So that was the real thought process about that. And obviously having that independence is great, especially with the cutback. Like obviously with Counterpressed, we sit within Spotify, but we also sit within the Ringer. And to be honest, editorially, they give us great freedom and creativity to really just like be ourselves and realize that people want to listen to us because of the content we make. So they're great at kind of leaving us to do what we do best. And with the cutback, I've tried to also bring in different writers and different voices so it feels like a community, and really listen to what people want to write. Like, to be honest, if people pitch something, like most of the time I'm just saying, yeah, do it, because it doesn't really exist anywhere else. So I think that's what's really exciting is a lot of it is like trial and error, which I love because I really like building things from scratch. And there's stuff that I put out on the cutback that hasn't done very well and stuff that's done really well. So you kind of, you figure out as you go along, and that's the beauty of it. And I feel like you probably have the same with all the stuff that you do. Like you just have to figure it out, and not everything is going to be a viral sensation from the off, or it takes time and patience. And I think that is one of the hardest things in like the modern internet world, is having the patience to realize like you need to take time to build things still, even though there's like opportunity at your fingertips.
100%. Yeah, we've done loads of trial and error stuff, and like for me, this was writing about the women's team was I only ever thought it would be like a bit of a side hustle in terms of like writing about men's football. I just looked and I was like, no one's doing this. Like, why aren't they doing it? And then I just thought, well, why don't I do it then? And actually, over time, as we've grown, like trying to add more stuff, and it has, like, we tried to do like a newslettery type thing about 5 or 6 years ago, but I just didn't do it very well because it didn't land at all, which was fine. So it just got quietly scrapped. But now we do have a weekly newsletter, like, which we've used Substack, and now we use Ghost for. But so like we've done a lot of that trial and error stuff. And one of the things I'm really interested in, Flo, as I've tried to work this out, and I'm still trying to work this out, like, who is the audience? What do they want? Obviously, I've come from writing about men's football, so and I still kind of treat things the same way as I would with men's football as well. But I mean, for me personally, like men's football content, I fall so squarely into the typical audience. Like, it's almost embarrassing. Like, I'm a 40-year-old white male, like, like very, very, like, I am the audience. Whereas making women's football content, that still makes up just about the majority of the audience, but it's a lot more mixed and a lot more diverse. And obviously, like, there are communities within women's football that I don't belong to. And I've kind of not struggled with that over the years, but thought about that over the years. Like, how do I serve that audience? Should I try? Is that just like appropriation? Is, like, how do I really try to tackle this? And I wonder if, particularly with Counterpressed, I really think like you've hit that fan culture thing really, really well. And, the people you've assembled to do that. And I know Becky in particular was doing a lot of stuff around that, like, women's football fan culture piece. Like, how conscious was all of that in terms of, like, did you really see an opportunity, or was it more, did you see an audience that wasn't being served with more traditional women's football content?
Well, I mean, firstly, thanks as well for all your support on Counterpressed, because you're always one of our biggest supporters online as well. So obviously to have you and your kind of obviously like status, especially within the Arsenal fan base, is massive to kind of back our work. But I think it was a bit of a combination of the two. Obviously, like with Becky and Jessie, and to an extent Kate and Gilly, although I think I'd worked with Gilly a few times and always really liked her, and kind of knew that there was something in there that could be really kind of uncovered. And I've been so excited to see that, since she started with Counterpress, the amount of stuff that she's doing in broadcast as well, which, I'm not going to pat us on the back too much, but I think, we we have really shown how great she is. But I think it was a combination. It was realizing, and this started with Upfront massively, like realize that people want to have fun. Like I think there is across the men's and women's game in football media, there's just a real lack of fun sometimes in the way that people talk about the game. And I think in the women's game, we suffer from it a little bit more, maybe because there's this balance of this desperation to be, you know, supposedly taken seriously in some circles. So therefore it's like, oh, we shouldn't have fun because we need to be super serious. But also it's a new game. So people are coming at it obviously with different approaches, different knowledge bases and things like that. So I think the having fun element was key, but also bringing actual conversation about football and culture together, because what we like to do is obviously like examine those culture bits, that fan side, events, talk about film, TV, like social things that are going on. And by social, I mean, you know, obviously like that intersection between football and gender and race and class and all those kind of things. But also making sure that when we talk about like, the game, we actually want to unpack it from an analytical point of view, because that's also really massively missing in the women's game. So it was like, how can we bring those three things together, and also give people opinions? And as you all know, Tim, that is tough, because if you want to give an opinion, you know that people aren't always going to agree with your opinion. And hey, I give opinions that people don't agree with all the time, and that's kind of the magic of working in sport, is that you are there to give an opinion, and people aren't always going to like that, and sometimes people agree with it, sometimes they don't. So for me, I wanted to bring people together who I knew were going to be fun, have a personality, but be willing to say something, be willing to have an opinion, because there is so much football content in the men's and women's game and people just sort of like nodding along and saying things, but actually it's interesting for people if someone's going to say, oh, you know what, I think this. And there's plenty of times where Jessie and I or Becky and I or whoever will disagree with each other in the pod, and those are the best bits. That's what I love when I see people's different opinions. And you know, especially probably when it comes to like Arsenal and Chelsea and those bigger sides, is like, you know, one of us might be a little bit more critical, one of us might be a little bit more positive on a game or whatever. And I think that's really important. So for me, those were like the core things, is filling that gap where so much of women's football coverage feels like quite neutral. It feels like constant just reporting rather than analysis, comment and opinion. And with what we kind of brought on Counterpressed in the audio side, I've tried to then develop what that can look like on the Cutback on the written side. And when I talk to people like Cutback, I really just try and picture of like, imagine a world in which you could have a women's football version of The Athletic, where you have like so many teams covered in depth, but you have it in one place for women's football. And that's what I really want to try and continue to develop. And a lot of it will be about bringing money on and who wants to pay to subscribe and all that kind of stuff, because at the moment I'm sort of just chucking my own money at it. And you know, as a freelancer, I want to make sure everyone gets paid. At the moment I'm paying people to write on the Cutback, not very much, but I am paying people, so that's really important for me. So sustainability is crucial. So that is my real like 2025 focus, is how can we make sure the Cutback sticks around, because I don't want it to be something that comes and goes. But I'm sure you find this as well, Tim, and I'll be interested to get your opinion on it, is with, especially with the Cutback and Counterpress, like we have a lot of people coming to it from different football experiences and different women's football experiences. So some people are like die hard and want the real in-depth tactical stuff. And some people are like quite new to the women's game and are sort of dipping their toe in. And sometimes that audience, trying to cater to both, can be tricky. And often you can't, like sometimes you can't hit both, and it's a you know, you can't win them all. But I find that an interesting balance now, because if for a lot of people that maybe came into the women's game in 2019 from that World Cup, we're now obviously like 5, nearly 6 years on, and they're wanting a bit more. They now feel like they've been here long enough that they want that deeper analysis. But some people are coming in from 22, 23, so they're sort of still finding their feet. So that's an interesting one for me, because I know that some people in the cutback are of the early kind, but I'm chucking them quite in-depth stuff. So I'm like, are you still enjoying this, or is this going over your head? So I think that's one that we continue kind of need to make sure that you're not excluding some audience because they're earlier on in that journey. But I always find as well is that even if you are a new football fan, you want to be treated like an old fan. You don't want to be like get the dumbed down content, because you want to feel like you've been here all along. So I'm very conscious as well of like giving people enough context that it makes sense without like holding their hand through it, because they're going to learn it. If they're passionate about football, they'll be doing what we were doing as kids, which is Panini sticker books, video games, and absorbing all that information, reading trivia books, whatever. And that's how you build that information. It's not necessarily just going to be one person writing an article that's going to like feed them everything they need.
Yeah, definitely. We've definitely thought about that over the years as well. That whole like, how do we cater for both audiences? And I think the thing I learned, I said earlier that about 6 years ago we were doing like a newslettery type thing, and I think the reason it flopped was because, well, I say flopped, it just didn't get great viewing figures, so I quietly canned it, was because I was trying to do something like, I was basically trying to do like a roundup thing. So I was like, a lot of our audience and Arseblog are like going to be fans of the men's team who are maybe curious about the women's team, for example. And I was kind of thinking, okay, let's cater for that audience so they can dip their toe in and out. I found that didn't work. I found over the years the best way is take people with you, because it's football. It's not that complicated. People will pick it up. And ultimately, like, I think when you invest in something and you show you're really interested and invested in it, and you show like the experience of writing about and watching the game over a long period of time, like you can really take people with you. And I think that's really what I've settled on over the years. It's like, what is my strength here? What is my kind of my real touch point? And I've come to see the job really as just trying to explain Arsenal to people. So like, why is the coach doing things? Why have they bought this player? Why did they play this way? And sometimes that gets confused with me like sticking up for the coach or whatever. But it's like, no, like what I'm actually trying to do is just explain, both through analysis and because I actually have the access to ask the individuals. Like, I'm just trying to explain what they're trying to do. And then whether you agree with it or not is kind of down to you. So like, I think I've just learned over the years, go with what you're strong at and bring people with you. But I am one person. What you're doing, I think, is quite different because you're using a network of people. But I think we'll take a quick break there and we'll continue this discussion right after this. Okay, so welcome back to the Arsenal Women Arsecast with me, your host, Tim Stillman, and delighted to be joined by guest Flo Lloyd Hughes, who behind the microphone in a different way this time, being grilled, being asked the big questions. But just before we broke, Flo, you talked about Gilly, for example, on the podcast, and Kate Longhurst as well. And I think, and I really, really hope this doesn't like sound patronising, because like, obviously they bring like great insight, both as, Kate's still playing, of course, and Gilly not long retired and been in the game for such a long time and such a big player. But, look, as someone from South London myself, I love hearing like an authentic Bermondsey accent on a podcast. That is something that is missing, not just from football media, just from media in general. But I guess in terms of, having like a current player and someone like Gilly who played with and for everyone at various points, and where you think the balance is at the moment between kind of access and criticism. And that's something we have to think about on Arseblog quite a bit. And, you guys, you've had like Carla Ward and Mark Parsons on the podcast and things like that. But like, particularly for Gillian and Kate, like, and I guess more in general in women's football kind of media, that sometimes thin line between not wanting to be too critical because it's a small world and everyone knows everyone.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. And if you want to make sure that you're being fair, that is, for me, is at the front and center of it all, is fairness around it. So I never want to be someone that is going to be overly critical in the words that I use just for the sake of it, but I always will give my fair and honest opinion of what I think, regardless of the individual, regardless of whether I know them or not. For me, it's always about giving my honest opinion on what I think of things. And especially when it comes to Carla Ward, who I respect and think she is, a great personality in women's football, and I'm excited to see where her next job is. There were times where I've criticised Carla a lot on the podcast, especially during that wobble she had the start last season with Villa. And, we talked a lot about it on the pods. And I know Carla listens pretty much to every show because she was listening on her commute from Sheffield to Birmingham, which is like 2.5 hours. So I always kind of knew in the back of my mind, like, there's a high chance Carla might listen to this, but a lot of the time you may say something where the person listening, they probably think the same or know the answer, because it's not rocket science. You're not saying anything that is like profound. You a lot of the time are just interpreting things that are actually there, in plain sight to see. So I think that for me is always where I really focus is just removing the personal side, and that comes from the criticism as well, is not making things personal. And I think, there's a real narrative, I think, in women's football at the moment around like Mark Skinner and who's going to criticize them and who's not. And I hate that little narrative, because really let people give their opinions on what they want to give, and it's not about it being personal and those personal connections. It's about giving people the platform to give their opinions. And I have had lots of interactions with Mark Skinner, and I think he's a really nice guy. I think Manchester United haven't been great this season, and those two things can be separate. You don't have to view those two things together. And I think that is really important. And that's why I think it's really refreshing to have people like Kate and Gilly on, because they don't seem to hold that pressure, even though they do have a lot of, obviously, colleagues and friends in the game. They, I think, are always honest and fair in the opinions they give as well. And that is really important to me. And, there have been times where we've been recording and I've kind of stopped and said, maybe let's word that differently, so you're not potentially like making it seem personal when you're giving that analysis or that opinion, because I think that is really important. Is that I think there's probably all people in football, especially when I think of the men's game, who just become like the villain, right? And people are just like, oh, like they're the villain character, and therefore we can only ever view them as this. And that has started to happen in the women's game a little bit too. And I think it's important when you sort of like try and check yourself on that a little bit and kind of make sure you're not falling into that trap, and you're examining things for what they are, whether it's poor performance, a poor result, whatever. And I actually think when I talk about the counterpress and the cutback in general, I always reference, and I don't know if you remember this, Tim, the Alex Greenwood column in the Telegraph just before Sky and BBC started Sky started their first media rights deal a number of years ago now. And obviously, like, when a player writes a column, it's going to be helpfully ghostwritten, right? But in general, and I any listener who hasn't seen it, you should definitely read it. So this would be like 2021, I think, or 2022. I can't.
It was Tom Gary.
Yeah.
That
so anyway,
it, yeah.
Start of the season, it's Sky's first deal, and Alex Greenwood was in her column talking about how the fact she was really excited about the new media rights deal with Sky, because it meant that she was going to be criticised, and she was excited to be criticised. She was excited for her game to be analysed. She was excited to have the same broadcast kind of approach and everything given to the women's game than it would be with the men's. And that really stuck with me because it made me realize that the way that we project on the women's game, that we shouldn't criticize, that we should only be cheerleaders, that we should think about players' feelings, etc., which is all important, because I'm not saying that, you should just be like horrible to a player just because you fancy it. What I mean is that players, in the main, expect to be criticized when they play badly, because actually, if you think about a lot of players, they know when they play badly too. So they want to be held to the highest level of performance. They want to be at their best. So they're not in this kind of naive alternative universe where they think they played well when they play badly. A lot of players expect, with the media coverage that has increased, for this level of criticism. And I think they also respect it a bit more when there's that honesty in the media. And yeah, what Alex Greenwood was saying in that column did really sit with me, because I thought, okay, we are in this new era now where we don't need to just be super nice and neutral all the time. We can really say our football opinions. And I stress football opinions here. I'm not saying people who go on social media and write personal comments, about players or managers or send them abuse. That is not the same. What I mean is, giving your critical analysis or opinion on the game and the performance. So those two things are very different. But I do think we are in a place now where people understand that and they respect that, and therefore, even if it's someone that you know personally and you're talking about, they're not going to take that in a way that feels personal. I mean, sometimes they will, and there's often that is just unfortunately something that comes with the job. Like, you can't be friends with these people like that. Often you can't be the reality of things, because you need to be able to give your honest opinion on things. But I think we're getting to a place where it's getting kind of more comfortable with people being willing to accept that.
Yeah, so obviously we have that on this podcast a lot, right? Because we're talking about one team, one set of players. That's all I really interact with. But the way I try to think of it, like we've had to talk about Beth Mead quite a lot recently, because like clearly her output is not where it was a couple of years ago. And the phrase I always try to use is, it would be disrespectful of her talent for me to say that she's been playing as well as she can. And I know you guys, in the most recent, not the most recent international break, maybe the one before, you had a conversation about Leah Williamson and her form. And I know that Leah herself knows that she wasn't playing at her best at that point and expected criticism for that, particularly as England captain. So these are all things obviously we have to think about, and sometimes my job can get quite awkward in that respect. So in Munich, for example, when things are really coming to a head with Jonas Eidevall, I'm one of the only kind of English journalists there, and I have to ask him if he's lost the dressing room. And that's not a nice question to ask, because I kind of know the person, the individual, a bit, not loads, but obviously I talk to him all the time. So having to say, have you lost the dressing room? Are the players still listening to you? Incredibly awkward moment, but I had to do it, and I had to put aside my own kind of feelings of awkwardness. So that's something definitely I have to think about so much, but really because I only deal with one club. One of the things you talked about earlier, Flo, as well, was about the kind of, I guess, the sense of nervousness in some parts of the audience about, which I completely understand, in terms of, trying to get women's football taken seriously has been such a battle for such a long time. But in terms of maybe that nervousness that exists within the audience about, if we have too much fun with this, people are going to not take this seriously. And I know you guys got some pretty unfair kickback around the FA Cup draw and things like that. And I actually really like some of the things the FA are doing with the women's FA Cup draws, because it looks to me like they're thinking we don't have to do this the same way as men's football. And I guess, judging that intersection between women's football content doesn't have to look like men's football content. And also we're probably not quite in the same battle anymore in terms of trying to get this taken seriously, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And just to follow up as well, actually, on something you said there, because I think there's a lot of people who operate in the kind of football content space who wouldn't consider themselves journalists, and then those of us who do. And I think when you do put your journalist hat on, that is when you can really make sure that you're being neutral. And obviously, none of us are perfect. There's always going to be biases. But I think having worked in football journalism for a very long time and broadcast journalism, like I have had to ask managers if they're going to be sacked. Like you were mentioning, that obviously, you had to ask Jonas Ardeval about that in Munich. I've had to do that, especially in radio interviews, and it is one of the most nerve-wracking things in the world. But it would be the most insane thing not to ask the question, and that it's the right thing to do. And you also know, I always think, for me, I always think about the audience. That relieves all the pressure, because I always think, what would the audience want to know? And I've had, men's managers literally call me an idiot because I've asked them a question about a bad performance. And would I prefer them not to call me an idiot? Absolutely. But that's kind of just, unfortunately, the reality of the job. But I do think if you focus on the audience and what they would want to know and what is important, that really helps, because you think, okay, I need to ask this question because the audience need to know. It's not about you. It's not about selfish thing about, oh, how will this person judge me? Because they know that when they come and hit the post match, they know they're going to be asked. They that's the reality. Everyone knows what's about to happen, and some managers handle it better than others. I've forgotten what your question was, Tim. It was about what the audience are ready for in terms of that. And I think season on season it's improving in terms of what the audience want to listen to, and whether they're kind of ready for a slightly different approach to things, or maybe it's a bit more criticism. I think there's still a bit of a split in the women's game, with people who want like more hot takes, more criticism, etc., and people who are still like, I just want to kind of like hear about my favorite players. And I do think there's a place for everybody. And I think my biggest tip for anyone is, don't try and cater to people who aren't going to listen to you anyway. I think because of social media, there is such a trap that people fall into, where they're always going to try and win over somebody who is never going to listen to you in the first place. And you can't let that be your sole focus, because you will actually lose out on the audience that do love you. And I think for me, that's always something that I really focus on. It's like, how can you make what you're doing better rather than change it to chase some audience that are never probably going to engage anyway? And I think because women's football is such a quick, like, moving and fast growing audience, you have to kind of like move as you go, which makes it more challenging. And I think that's why it's like every season it's changing so rapidly, because more people are wanting different things, and like that, it makes it, I think, the hardest thing to like constantly be creative, constantly keep stuff churning, making sure you're like getting everything. And yeah, I think it's just staying in tune with the audience is really important.
That's something I've definitely had to learn over the years. It's almost like, the plane takes off and you put the engines in afterwards, and you kind of work out what your audience wants, what your audience values along the way. And for us as well, it's so much easier for me and us now, because I don't have to think about trying to serve all of the audience, because of like outlets like some of the ones that you're on, for example. Like, I don't have to worry so much about trying to hit various touch points that I'm probably not equipped to hit anyway, quite frankly. So it was probably different like 10 years ago, when, albeit the audience was smaller, but it was like, God, I'm really one of the only people doing this. So how do I try and speak to everyone? And actually, the answer is exactly what you just said. I don't really try anymore. I don't kind of have to. And I think I've learned along the way that, like, play to your strengths, do what you do, and bring people with you. But Flo, that was a really, really interesting conversation. Thank you as well for putting up with my incredibly spotty internet upstairs, because my daughter is off school. I'm not recording in my usual space and the signal strength is not as good. But Flo, I think most of our audience know all about Counterpressed and probably listen to it, but where can they find the Cutback?
Yeah, so please definitely sign up to the Cutback. You can type in thecutback.com, or if you type in the Cutback in Google, we're still pretty high up the SEO rankings, or find the Cutback on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and it's free to sign up at the moment, and it's going to be free for a few more months. Then we're going to be making it a subscription service, but there will always be some free content on there. But the plan is to really continue to build it into this amazing membership community with really good writing that people want to pay for. But it's also not just the writing side. There's live chats, there's events, there's like discussion boards, there's all that kind of stuff. So please do sign up. And if you do sign up, you can drop me an email on there with your thoughts on what you would like to see on there as well, which is one of my favorite things, is kind of hearing from people on what they want. So yeah, find us there.
Thanks so much, Flo. And for the Arsenal element of it, it's Max Radwan writing about Arsenal, who's been on this podcast a couple of times. Really, really good writer, particularly with the kind of tactical elements as well. So thoroughly recommend him and that if you're just interested in the Arsenal context of it. But personally, I really value it as well in terms of when Arsenal are playing someone, I like to know a little bit about the opponent. So, for example, before we played Spurs recently, there was a great article actually with really great detail about Tottenham and how their games have gone this season and when they tend to fall behind, and that kind of IQ, I think, about the teams Arsenal are playing, or you might just be interested in great women's football writing. But Flo,
thanks so much, Tim.
Thanks
really
so much
enjoyed
for joining
it.
us. And we will be back probably after, we will probably do an episode on the new manager whenever that is announced, because that probably will be announced. I'm told Arsenal very much do want to make that appointment before things kick off again in January, so we'll probably do an episode around that. But whenever that happens, I don't know at the moment. But thanks so much for joining us as ever, and we will speak to you again very soon.